My name is Vanessa, and for the last 5 years I have been working tirelessly as a manager at the Hotel Horizon, a place where every day started way too early and ended well after midnight, but brought an exhausting but still stable and useful feeling, because among the hustle and bustle of constant customer complaints, broken doors, late orders, and endless phone calls, I managed to maintain order, earn respect, and still manage not to lose my head. The salary was good enough to afford to rent a decent one-room apartment in the south of the city, in an area with small bakeries and quaint parks, and at the same time put aside a little money each month to buy my own place, which I dreamed of since I graduated from high school, because it always seemed to me that every person should have a place where the walls belong only to him, where every shelf is arranged as he wishes, where no one intrudes without permission, and where, having closed the door, you can finally exhale. And before we continue, write in the comments from which city you are watching this video. Enjoy watching. My parents, of course, were good people, simple, reserved, tired, like most people of their generation, who lived from paycheck to paycheck and never really complained, because they simply did not know that it was possible to do otherwise. Dad worked as a warehouse manager for almost 20 years, and his weekdays were spent between boxes, delivery notes, and shifts of loaders, and Mom worked part-time in the elementary school cafeteria, always smelling of fried cutlets and apple pie, which she hated to bake, but baked anyway, because the children liked it. They never had extra money, but they always tried to provide for me and my brother. There was food on the table, clothes, although not fashionable, but warm, too, and I never heard them complain, although now I understand how difficult it must have been for them. And I also have a brother, Leon. He's 28 now, 2 years younger than me, and if there was a definition of the word reckless, his picture would be right there, a guy who never held a job for more than 6 months, who was constantly searching for himself, looking for inspiration, and in reality, just hiding from responsibility. He dropped out of college in his 3rd year, the same college I helped pay for with my first, albeit modest, paycheck, because I still believed that if I tried hard enough, he could be more than just our little brother who always got into trouble. Instead, he began a series of odd jobs: delivery boy, waiter, photographer's assistant, promoter, clothing store consultant, and even more random girls, one after another, all of whom seemed the same, loud, awkward, and completely incapable of holding a conversation for more than 5 minutes. About 2 years ago, Leon showed up at my door with 2 huge duffel bags and a heart-wrenching story about how his landlord was a lunatic who kicked him out for no reason, although I knew then that there was probably a good reason. I let him sleep on my couch, which I had spent 6 months trying so hard to buy, choosing between fabrics and colors, comparing prices, saving every penny I could to afford some furniture worthy of a grown, independent woman. This couch eventually became his temporary bed, and at the same time my headache, because one night turned into a week into a month, and in the end it all turned into a 3-month nightmare with endless friends, loud music, milk disappearing from the refrigerator, and some strange smells in the bathroom. "Vanessa, come on, it's just a few friends," he'd say, waving his arms when I'd be exhausted after a 12-hour shift and find 4 strangers scattered across the furniture like dust on the floor, amid empty beer bottles and dirty socks, in my living room. "Leon, we've already talked about this. No partying on weekdays. You promised. Don't get so worked up. We're keeping it quiet." But he wasn't keeping it quiet. He didn't care. The last straw was when I walked in on him and some girl with a thick layer of makeup and long fake nails having sex right there on my couch one night. My couch, the one I'd been denying myself coffee on the way to work for almost 6 months. Then I just froze, with the keys in my hands, and then I exhaled, went out, went into the bedroom, got a pillow and, returning, said, "You have a week to find another place." He was, of course, shocked. He ran to his mom and dad and made a scene. A day later, my mom called me, in tears, as usual, accusing me of cruelty, saying that I was betraying the family. Dad picked up the phone and added that I was being selfish, because Leon was going through a transitional period. Transitional. At 26. I lost my temper. When I was 26, I shouted into the phone, "I paid my bills and sent you money every month to pay for his education." We hung up. And didn't talk for 2 months. Then, of course, everything got better. Because, as always, I backed down first. I apologized, invited them for coffee, bought them a cake. But from that moment on, there was a crack inside me. Because I will never forget how quickly they took his side without hearing me. The story of my life. So when Mom called last week and invited me to dinner on Saturday, I didn't think much of it. Just the usual family dinner we'd started having again. Vanessa, dear, it's been too long. Come around 6, she said, and there was sincerity in her voice. Daddy's grilling steaks. Sure, Mom. Should I bring anything? Be yourself, honey, she said with a soft laugh. I arrived promptly at 6, as promised, with a bottle of red wine in my bag. Mom hugged me at the door. The house smelled of grilled meat and onions, and I heard voices from the living room. Daddy, Leon, and someone else, a woman's voice, a ringing laugh I didn't recognize. When I walked in, Leon had his arm around the shoulders of a blonde, perfect from head to toe, as if she'd stepped out of a commercial rather than out of life. Flawless makeup, hair in waves, a dress that was clearly not cheap. Vanessa, Leon jumped up, beaming. This is Julia. My fiancée. And at that moment I almost choked with stunning shock. Fiancé. Since when? 3 weeks ago. Julia answered before Leon, casually stretching her hand over the table to show off a ring with a stone so large in the center that I couldn't help but wonder if it was a fake or if she had somehow found a jeweler willing to work on credit, because Leon's bank account would hardly support such luxury. Leon has told me so much about you, she said in a voice that was slightly theatrical, as if she had rehearsed each phrase in advance. Mom and Dad looked at them with such sincere affection, as if they had just witnessed the discovery of a vaccine for all diseases at once. Dad, without stopping to fill glasses, offered now salad, now sauce, and Mom touched Julia's hand with admiration, as if trying to make sure that it was real, and repeated over and over, "Isn't she magnificent, Vanessa?" As if she expected an enthusiastic sigh and applause from me. I nodded reservedly, trying not to grimace, because even with the naked eye it was obvious that Julia was a girl with pretensions to status, self-confident and at the same time strangely unnatural, as if she had been seated at this table for demonstration. During dinner, I noticed more and more how Julia intercepted the conversation, how skillfully she interrupted, inserting her own stories, bright, filled with names, locations, drama, but completely devoid of content. When I mentioned the potential promotion I'd been waiting for at work for 3 months, she immediately launched into a story about how she'd once been approached for an interview by a very hit company in New York City, but had turned it down after thinking about it because she felt there wasn't much room for creative expression. So what do you do, Julia? I finally asked, deciding it was time for a little more specificity. Oh, I'm unemployed right now, she said, as if that was a status that came with a bonus. I used to do fashion marketing, but now I'm looking for something deeper, more fulfilling, you know? Her voice was soft and enveloping, but there was a hint of superiority to it, as if regular work was for mere mortals and she was born for something greater, something ephemeral and beyond our comprehension. I nodded, pretended it was a perfectly reasonable position, and took another bite of steak, thinking that the whole situation was a carefully chosen but poorly executed performance. After dinner, when the plates were nearly empty and a sweet tiredness hung in the air, Mom cleared her throat, a sound I knew from childhood, and always knew would lead to a conversation I wanted to escape. Dad nodded to her, and she folded her hands on the table and said, "Vanessa, dear, there's something we wanted to talk to you about. That's why we invited you here tonight." I frowned. I thought it was to meet Julia, I said, glancing at the smiling couple. Well, yes, that too, Mom said quickly, but her voice became stern. But there's something else. She took a deep breath, and I already knew that it didn't bode well. Your father and I discussed it and decided that you should help Leon and Julia with their apartment, she said. I put my fork down, slowly. Help them find a place to live? I asked, although my gut already knew it was worse. Dad shook his head. No, we'll give you a deposit and pay the first month, but we thought with your good salary and all, you could take on the monthly rent. I looked around the table. Mom looked pleading, Dad looked expectant, Julia looked like she really should, and Leon avoided my gaze. Let me get this straight, I said, enunciating each word with special clarity. You want me to pay Leon and Julia rent every month? Mom nodded. Until Leon finds a suitable job. And Julia, too, of course. I looked at my brother, whose gaze seemed to flicker with something like guilt, and at Julia, who didn't even try to hide her displeasure, as if my resistance was an insult to her personally. No one said a word. Everyone waited. No, I said, putting my napkin down. Of course not. There was a deathly silence. The air seemed heavy, and I felt like I was straining myself to take each step toward my purse. My mother was the first to break the silence. Vanessa, think about what you're saying. Your brother needs you. He's 28, Mom. He's an adult. He doesn't need me to pay his rent. My father's face flushed, as it always did when he was impatient. That's it. You're not going to help your brother? I glanced at Leon, who was intently studying the remains of his plate, and at Julia, whose gaze had taken on something distant and arrogant, as if I were not a relative but an enemy. Leon can get a job like everyone else, I said, slinging my purse over my shoulder. And so can Julia. 2 incomes is more than enough to pay the rent. Mom stood up abruptly, her voice rising. Your brother is looking for a job. He just hasn't found the right opportunity yet. And Julia needs time to find something worthy of her talents. I almost laughed. Worthy of her talents. She'd known Leon for, a couple of months. And she was already confidently manipulating my parents like an old, experienced politician. This conversation is over, I said, turning toward the door. I'm not paying them rent. End of story. Mom followed me, her face contorted with anger, and her voice took on that raspy tension that always came when she felt she was losing control of a situation. If you walk out that door without agreeing to help, there will be consequences, Vanessa. I stopped at the threshold, turned my head to look once more at her tense face, full of hurt and disappointment, and, trying to speak calmly but clearly, said, "Good night, Mom," before opening the door, going out and slamming it behind me with a dull thud, thus cutting off the remnants of not only dinner but also illusions. The drive home was blurry, as if a fine, invisible rain had suddenly appeared on the windshield, only instead of drops there was anger, stubbornness, and silent bewilderment. My hand was shaking on the steering wheel. I clenched my fingers with effort to keep the anger from taking over, because a voice was humming inside me, repeating over and over again, "How could they? How dare they?" The absolute impudence of them, to demand, not to ask, not to explain, but to demand, as if it were due, as if something that by default is part of my duties, because I am the one who always drags. I've always been the one in charge, the one who worked nights in college to pay for it, the one who got a job right after graduation and sent money home so my parents could cover the bills, the one who helped with repairs, with food, with treatment when my mom had her first seizure. I'm the one who paid for Leon's first 2 years of school, hoping that for once in his life he'd show some gratitude, some effort, but instead he got a wasted education and an endless string of excuses. When I finally got to my apartment, the silence greeted me like an old friend, and I fell onto the couch, fully dressed, only to see the phone on the armrest blinking, illuminating the dark room with a cold white light, messages coming one after another, like blows. First Leon, "Come on, sis. Don't be like that." Then Mom, "I'm so disappointed in your selfishness tonight." Then Dad, "Call Mom. She's upset." And finally, the one that threw me off balance, a text from Julia, whose number I didn't even have. "Leon told me you'd be difficult." I think he was right. I turned off the phone in disgust and threw it on the couch, as if I wanted to shake all the lies, pressure, and moral manipulation out of him. I needed time, some peace, to process all this madness without giving in to the usual guilt that had grown up in the shadow of my parents' disappointment since childhood. The next morning, as soon as I turned on my phone again, the stream of messages continued, long, short, angry, plaintive, full of innuendo and outright accusations. They were all variations on the same theme: I'm selfish, I don't care about my family, I betrayed my brother, I could have helped and didn't want to. Not a single word about how ridiculous the request itself was. Not a single admission that I owed them nothing. I didn't respond to a single message. I just closed myself off. Instead, I threw myself into work, with the same focus that always saved me when emotions threatened to overwhelm me. The end of the year was approaching, which meant the time for summing up, reports, presentations, and, of course, annual reviews, on which so much depended: reputation, bonuses, the chance for a promotion. This year I was really good. I raised guest satisfaction, reduced turnover, improved communication between departments, and even found ways to reduce costs without sacrificing service. None of this went unnoticed. My immediate supervisor began to hint more and more that a very nice bonus might be on the horizon. Then, one gray, tired day, I was called into the regional manager's office. She greeted me with a smile and handed me a heavy envelope with gold embossing across the table. "Vanessa, your results this year have been exceptional. We want to thank you for your dedication. This is our way of saying thank you." I opened the envelope and held my breath for a second. The amount was almost twice what I expected, and in that moment I knew that, given my savings, I finally had enough for a down payment on my own home. This was not just an achievement, it was a milestone I had been working toward for years. That evening, sitting on the couch with a glass of red wine, I called my old college roommate, Diana, who had gone into real estate after graduating. "I think I'm finally ready to buy a place," I said, feeling like something heavy had been lifted, like an invisible weight had been lifted. "Can you help me look, Dee?" "That's awesome, Vanessa." "Of course I can. Give me some time, I'll find some listings that will suit you." Over the next few weeks, Diana and I looked at dozens of apartments. Some were too noisy, others were too dark, others had a strange smell that no amount of air freshener could get rid of. I wanted a place that would be a reflection of me, not luxurious, not showy, but warm, bright, with windows you want to look out of in the morning and walls you want to be silent in the evening. Something close to work, with good natural light and enough space for me to live as well as sleep. My parents and Leon had been silent all this time, and that silence had been a real gift to me. I figured they might have finally understood and backed off, stopped trying to pressure me, or at least acknowledged my right to say no. And then one Saturday, under the gentle sun and the chirping of birds, we found it, a one-room apartment in a safe, well-kept building with a small but cozy balcony overlooking the park. The kitchen had been recently renovated in light colors, with clean lines and modern appliances, and the bedroom was not too big, but quite large enough for the double bed I had been dreaming of since I realized I was tired of sleeping alone on an old sofa. But that wasn't the main thing. The main thing was that this apartment could be mine. My real territory, no division, no guests without asking, no talk of debt. "I'll make an offer today," Diana said, confidently checking her phone. "With your preliminary approval and the current market situation, we have every chance." I didn't tell my parents. I knew what would happen if I did. There would be more plans, calculations, pleas, and maybe even direct pressure for Leon and Julia to move in with me. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon, filled with the usual morning ritual: a cup of coffee with cardamom, the sun shining through the curtains, a warm blanket on my legs, and a book that I had finally gotten around to reading after a week full of work and disappointment. Outside the window, the cars were making a lazy noise, something was creaking in the kettle in the kitchen, and I hadn't expected this peace to be shattered by a sudden, insistent ringing of the doorbell. For a split second, I froze, wondering whether I should answer. Perhaps the delivery guy had reached the wrong door, perhaps a neighbor with a question, but part of me wanted to just not move, to remain in this fragile balance. I wished I had followed that impulse. When I walked up and opened the door, I saw my parents standing right next to the threshold, and behind them, Leon and Julia, who didn't have a hint of an apology or even a hint of embarrassment. Without waiting to be invited, Mom pushed past me into the hallway as if this was all a matter of course, waving her arms at Julia with the intonation of a tour guide leading VIPs through the royal chambers. "This is the living room, of course. That's the kitchen. Vanessa's bedroom is at the end of the hall, the largest one, facing west, so it gets lovely light in the evenings. It'll be yours and Leon's. And Vanessa can sleep here on the pull-out sofa." I froze, as if all the air had been sucked out of the room, and watched as Julia slowly nodded, studying my apartment with the air of a housewife deciding whether to reupholster a sofa. It's smaller than I expected, but I think it'll do for now, she said without a hint of irony, and there was a bored concession in her voice, as if I'd suggested she spend the night in the utility room. Finally, I gathered my courage, stepped forward, and stood between them, silencing my mother. What exactly is happening right now? I asked, keeping my voice low but putting all the steel I could muster into my words. My mother turned to me with a smile that held no warmth or joy, just a forced mask of irritation beneath. Don't you remember what I said at dinner? Her voice turned icy. If you don't help, there will be consequences. Here they are. Leon and Julia are moving in with you. They need a stable start. They'll take your bedroom, and you'll live in the living room. It's simple. We won't pay rent. Leon added, his cheeks barely reddening, well, yeah, it's temporary, and fell silent, not daring to meet my gaze. I opened my mouth to let out all the fury, to tell them all to get out of my life and my apartment, to explain how wild and presumptuous and absurd this was, but then a thought occurred to me, cold and clear as a winter morning. The purchase of my new apartment had been approved 2 days ago. I was just waiting for the paperwork to close, so I could sign the final papers and move in. And so, instead of the outburst they were clearly expecting, the scene they were hoping for, I slowly forced a smile. You know what? Okay, I said, surprised at how calm my voice sounded. But I need 2 weeks to get everything organized. I need to talk to the landlord, pack my things, get ready to move in. Their faces froze in a look of surprise so genuine it almost cost me all my self-control, but Mom quickly caught herself and nodded. Okay then. I'm glad you're finally being reasonable. As soon as the door closed behind them, I grabbed the phone without waiting for a break and dialed Diana. As I explained the situation, my hands shook not from fear, but from anger and anticipation. Diana, I need to close the deal as soon as possible. Everything is ready, just tell me what and when to sign, I said, feeling control returning to me with each word. I understand, she answered without further ado. If the seller agrees to expedite the deal, we can sign everything by the end of next week. I'll take care of it. The next morning, I called Mr. Peterson, my landlord. He was one of the few who always kept his word, and I hoped that his common sense would not let me stray from my course. So you're moving out, but your brother, can he stay? He asked after my vague explanation. I tried to speak softly, but clearly. I paid until the end of the month, but yes, I'm leaving. Leon doesn't have a contract with you, so technically he's a guest. Mr. Peterson paused before he answered, a pause I could hear even through the phone. I appreciate the warning, he said. If your brother wants to stay after the lease is up, he'll have to apply and sign his own contract. Otherwise, he'll have to move out. The relief I felt was beyond words. Thank you for understanding, I said, sincerely. The next week was a whirlwind of paperwork, phone calls, packing boxes, and organizational fever. Diana, like a magician, negotiated with the seller, expedited the work with the bank, and by Friday I was sitting in my new apartment, pen in hand, signing document after document. I had never seen so much paper demanding my signature in my life, but each line felt like a nail, nailing my freedom to reality. That weekend, without telling my family, I began the move. I hired movers to move the furniture I had once so carefully selected, and made dozens of trips in my car, hauling away boxes of books, clothes, and favorite little things that made the space mine. Everything happened quickly, and despite my fatigue, I felt a surge of euphoria. For the first time in many years, I was responding not to someone else's requests or expectations, but to myself. By Sunday evening, the only things left in my rented apartment were those essentials that created the illusion of continued presence: a couple of cups in the kitchen, a folded blanket on the couch, a few books on the nightstand, and soap in the bathroom, as if I had just stepped out for a while on business and was about to return. My new apartment, on the other hand, felt almost unreal, an echoing space, sparkling countertops, the smell of freshly opened white paint, and the feeling of entering not just a room but a new dimension where everything was yours. I spent Sunday night there, curled up on a mattress I'd placed on the floor since the bed frame hadn't arrived yet, and despite the lack of the usual coziness and soft pillows, I slept better than I had in weeks because for the first time in a long time I could go to bed feeling like I wouldn't be disturbed. Monday morning, as if nothing had happened, I got into my rental car and drove to work, following my usual route, stopping back at the rental apartment in the evening, not because I needed to, but to pick up the mail and make sure everything was still there. Leon wrote to me several times during the week, asking when he and Julia would be able to move in, and I answered evasively each time, repeating that I was still sorting out the organizational details with the landlord. By the following Saturday, everything was ready. Most of the furniture and things were already in the new place. The kitchen was partially equipped, the bed was finally assembled, and I felt like my own, autonomous world was being built step by step. I left the spare key to the rented apartment under the doormat, as I had promised Leon, with a neutral message, as if everything was going according to plan, and I drove to my new apartment with the last of the boxes, where, as soon as I crossed the threshold, I kicked off my shoes with relief and allowed myself to exhale. Around noon, the phone rang. My brother's name was on the screen. I forced myself to answer with feigned warmth in my voice. "Hello. Are you there yet?" "Yes, we are here," Leon's voice said, and then he added, "Where are you?" "Oh, I was called away on an emergency last-minute trip," I lied, feeling no guilt. "I'll be gone for about a week. Make yourself at home." In the background, I heard Julia's voice. "Who are you talking to?" Leon whispered something in response, and soon Julia said loudly, "Okay. Tell her to stay on this trip as long as possible." Leon laughed awkwardly. "Julia says hi." What should we know about this place?" "Just that I've already spoken to Mr. Peterson, the owner of the apartment. He knows I'm not here. The rest is up to you." Cool, Leon muttered. "Well, have a nice trip." I hung up, stifling my laughter, and went back to unpacking the last box in my bedroom. The week flew by. I lived my life, worked, returned home to my apartment, and every evening, closing the door behind me, I enjoyed the feeling that I had been missing for so long: peace, predictability, and a space where no one would intrude without asking. I did not respond to my parents' messages, who began writing on the second day, cautiously asking how things were going. I did not want to explain, defend myself, or justify myself. For the first time in a long time, I had a choice, and I chose silence. Exactly 1 week after Leon and Julia moved into my former rental, my phone blew up with a series of incoming calls, my brother's name coming up over and over again. I ignored the first 4, letting him leave a voicemail, but when he called for the 5th time in a row, I gave in. "Vanessa. You need to get back here ASAP." Leon blurted out, his tone of voice clear that panic was overwhelming him. "The landlord came by today and said the rent is only paid until the end of the month. He wants me to sign a new lease or we have to move out." I paused, feigning confusion. "Yeah. That's how rent works, Leon. But Mom and Dad said you'd let us live for free." His voice grew shrill. "I never agreed to this," I replied calmly, clearly, as if I'd rehearsed it in my head. "And by the way, this isn't my apartment anymore." I moved out. There was a long silence, heavy with confusion. "What? Where do you live now?" he finally breathed out. "I bought my own apartment," I said, and there was a note of pride in my voice that I didn't even try to hide. "I've been saving for years, Leon. Years. And I finally had enough for a down payment. So you just abandoned us? Here? With nothing? In a couple of weeks, we'll have nowhere to go," he almost shouted. "You have a choice, Leon. You've always had one. Get a job and pay rent. Move back in with Mom and Dad. Find a cheaper option. These are the same options you had before you decided you could take over my life." Leon hung up. 15 minutes later, my mother called. I mustered all my inner calm and answered. "Vanessa Mitchell, what have you done?" she asked without preamble, her voice taut as a string ready to snap. "I bought my own place." "Mom, I'm a homeowner now," I said, trying to put sincere excitement, warmth, a subtle, almost childish hope into my voice that at least this news would bring her real joy, That for the first time in a long time her voice would sound not irritated, not reproachful, but proud, light as an exhalation, like once in childhood, when I brought home a certificate for an essay contest or won a school Olympiad. No luck. Mom did not hesitate for a second. Her voice, imbued with a coldness that barely contained anger, sounded in the receiver with an accusation, as if I had committed a betrayal. You deliberately set up your brother. You allowed him to think that he could stay in your apartment. I closed my eyes and exhaled slowly, trying to maintain my composure. No, Mom, I said evenly. I let you all think that. Because you didn't give me a choice. You literally showed up at my door and announced that you were taking my bedroom. Without asking, without discussing it, just deciding for me. That's because you refused to help your brother. She was almost screaming now, and I could picture her lips pressed together, pacing the kitchen, gesturing into the air. And now you've bought a place. Well, then you can give Leon and Julia your address, and I'll move in with you. There. I paused for a moment, trying not to lose my temper, and then, taking a deep breath, I exhaled. No, Mom. That won't happen. I won't give anyone my new address. Leon will never move in with me again. Never. And then, like a dam breaking, her anger flooded the phone line. She called me ungrateful, selfish, heartless, words I didn't want to remember even on my darkest day, and if this had happened 10 years ago, I might have burst into tears from the pain, the guilt, and the fear that I would lose her love forever. But not now. I held the phone away from my ear and waited for her anger to burn out like a fire without fuel. When she finally ran out of steam, I returned the phone to my ear. Are you finished? I asked quietly. Don't you dare talk to me like that. I raised you better than that, she growled. You raised me to be independent and self-sufficient, Mom. And that's exactly what I became, I replied. You were raised to help the family, she countered, but I could no longer contain my bitterness. I helped the family, Mom. For many years. I paid for Leon's college. I let him into my apartment. I let him violate my boundaries, bring strangers, throw parties, live off me. I've helped you since I was 18. But now, Mom, it's Leon's turn to help himself. There was a heavy, dull silence on the other end of the line. Then a short click. She hung up. I stared at the screen where her name was still flashing, and then, without giving myself time to doubt, I opened my contacts and blocked all the numbers, Mom's, Dad's, Leon's, even Julia's, whose rare but caustic messages were still in the phone's memory. I knew that right now I needed only one thing, peace. Peace without manipulation, pressure, emotional blackmail, and constant demands. I needed time to finally feel what it was like to live for myself. That night, I wandered around my new apartment for a long time, running my hands along the smooth walls, opening and closing closets, examining my reflection in the brand new mirror in the bathroom, sitting on the couch and simply allowing myself to accept the fact that this space is mine, completely mine, and subject to no one but me. No landlord to account for every noise, no roommates intruding on the quiet of the evening, no unexpected guests on the couch, just me and the walls into which I had invested my work, my dream, my freedom. For the next 2 months, I lived as if in a warm, calm bubble. I furnished the apartment with furniture that I chose carefully, stopping at each sample, imagining how it would look in the evening light, how it would fit into my rhythm. I painted one of the walls in the living room a rich turquoise color, filling the room with a feeling of sea freshness, lightness, and something new that had not been in my life before. On the balcony, I began to grow herbs, mint, basil, thyme, and every evening, pouring myself some tea, I went out there, breathed and felt how calmness entered my life. The work was going well. I was getting things done, my clients were happy, my team listened to me with respect, and my boss was considering me for another promotion. Life had finally taken shape that I liked, clear, stable, honest. But I hadn't completely cut off all ties to the world I'd lived in. I still kept in touch with a few mutual friends, people who'd known Leon and me since childhood, weren't involved in the family drama, but sometimes brought news. It was from them, or more precisely from my friend Tara, that I learned that Leon and Julia had finally moved back in with my parents. Tara ran into my mom at the grocery store, and, as happens in small towns, the conversation quickly began. Mom was complaining. She said that money was tight at home, that Dad was taking on extra shifts at the warehouse, that groceries were more expensive, and the bills were higher. Leon and Julia had taken the spare bedroom, and according to Tara, neither of them had ever worked. Their parents, it turned out, were supporting them entirely, providing food and paying their bills, and it seemed to be getting beyond the limits of even their tolerance. I felt a twinge of sympathy, not for Leon, but for Mom and Dad, who had created this vicious cycle by allowing him to believe for years that he had the right not to try, not to grow, not to be responsible for his actions. But that sympathy quickly turned to disappointment, because no matter how many times I tried to explain to them what they were doing, they always took Leon's side. And now, when reality finally came to them, the consequences I had long foreseen, they were reaping the consequences of their choice. One evening, returning home from work, I put the kettle on as usual, kicked off my shoes by the door, and, settling into a chair with a blanket, picked up my laptop to check my personal email, expecting to see mostly advertising mailings, automatic notifications, and useless offers that filled my inbox. And in this digital noise, where everything had long since lost its individuality, I suddenly saw a name that made my heart stop for a moment. The letter was from my father. The inbox showed that it had arrived several hours ago, and I almost deleted it without even opening it, acting more on instinct than consciously. So strong was my desire to avoid any communication with my family, but something, perhaps simple human curiosity, or perhaps hope that had not yet completely died out, stopped me. And I clicked. The letter was short, just a few paragraphs, but each one was written with the quiet sincerity that had always distinguished my father from my mother, whose emotionality had become, over the years, a scream that drowned out all other forms of expression. Vanessa, I don't know if you'll read this, it began, but I wanted to apologize. Your mother and I were wrong to insist so much that you support Leon. He is our son, and his decisions, his behavior, are our responsibility, not yours. Things were difficult here when he and Julia lived with us. We tried to convince them to get jobs, but it was more difficult than we thought. I miss hearing from you. If you don't mind, call me sometime. Love, Dad. I read the letter 3 times, slowly, word by word, as if testing it for authenticity, not trusting that it wasn't a false note in the same old, tired melody of accusations and demands. It wasn't a full apology, not a confession for everything that had been done and said, not an admission of all the years when I had been nothing more than a convenient crutch for them to lean on at any time, but it was something. It was the first step toward meeting them halfway. I didn't respond right away. I needed time to process, to figure out what kind of relationship I really wanted to save, if any. I wasn't ready to let them back in completely, not when the wounds were still burning, but I wasn't completely close to reconciliation either. On my terms. Without going back to the past, where my opinions mattered nothing. A week passed. In the middle of the workday, while I was reviewing reports, my internal phone suddenly rang. Vanessa, came the secretary's voice from the lobby, a gentleman is here to see you. He says he's your father. My hand hovered over the mouse for a moment. My heart began to beat faster. I'll be right down, I said, not quite aware that I was already getting up from the table. Dad was standing downstairs, hunched over, his hands in his pockets, looking older than I remembered him from just 6 months ago. His face lit up with a hesitant, almost shy smile when he saw me. We walked across the street to a cafe, chose a table by the window, and for the first time in a long time he really spoke to me, not like a parent lecturing, not like an advocate for his youngest son, but like someone interested in a conversation he was having with me. He spoke quietly, in that even voice I remembered from my childhood, when he was explaining to me how a refrigerator worked or why you had to balance on a bicycle. He told me how things had gotten worse at home, how Julia had quickly taken over, demanding special treatment, treating them like hotel staff, with the neglect and whims that had become their daily norm. How Leon, instead of changing anything, had simply given in, resigned himself, diluting any hint of responsibility. She shows no initiative. And he doesn't force her. Your mother doesn't want to admit it, he said, looking down, but we made mistakes. We thought we were helping him, that we were protecting him, when in fact we were just making him dependent. And we were unfair to you, he added, looking me straight in the eye for the first time that conversation. We expected too much from you because you always managed. We used your strength, your intelligence, your kindness. We abused it. I sat silently, sipping my coffee, feeling the corners of my eyes begin to prickle, not tears of pain, but relief, an acknowledgement I'd waited too long to let pass. He reached across the table and touched my hand lightly, almost hesitantly. I'm proud of you, Vanessa. For sticking it out. For building your life. I know I've said this too rarely, maybe never. I'm sorry. We talked for nearly 2 hours, jumping from topic to topic, from my new apartment and my promotion to his worries about retirement and the strain of the home. It wasn't a conversation that could heal everything. Mom was still angry. Leon was still unemployed. The hurts of the past still lived inside us, in every fold of our memories. But it was a start. As we said goodbye at the door, he hugged me tightly, like those rare moments in childhood when a silent embrace replaced everything that couldn't be said in words. I won't tell your mother and Leon that we saw each other, he promised. It's your choice. You decide when and if you're ready. I walked back to work lightly, almost weightlessly. Something inside me shifted. I couldn't call it forgiveness. Not yet. But for the first time, I felt a sense of possibility. And maybe that was even more important. I didn't regret anything. Not my firmness, not the fact that I set boundaries, not the fact that I didn't let my family dictate my life. I earned it myself, this silence, this order, this joy from every morning when I opened my eyes in my own home. Sometimes people call it selfishness. But it's not selfishness. It's self-preservation. And sometimes, when you finally put yourself first, others begin to see that you are a person, not a tool for someone else's expectations. That night, sitting in the silence of my apartment, surrounded by things that I had chosen, that I had paid for, that reflected only my taste, my choices, my personality, I felt something new. Not just contentment, but peace. Real. Earned. Untouchable.